Hey everyone, my name is Mike Henry, and this is my Procreate 4 demo for the piece I call Sagat the King. So this is another Street Fighter character. I alluded in the Akuma video that I was going to do another Street Fighter character. This here is Sagat. Now this is a bit of a weird piece because as you can see here, I went with really weird dimensions. This is essentially 4K that's then been doubled with the DPI set really high. And you can see over there on maximum layers, this really screws me over at 15 layers for somebody like myself who uses a lot of layers. So what did that end up resulting in? This. A ton of little files that then had to be composited. It was a really interesting technical challenge, and I actually enjoyed this despite some of the frustrating moments, but let's go through the whole process. This was really hard to edit together because, as you can imagine, with all of those little files that are essentially like branching alternate realities, each one of them produced a different capture file that I then had to figure out where they all sort of landed in the process and edit them together. So this is as accurate as possible. It's fairly accurate actually, but it's as accurate as possible with maybe a little of missing a little bit of information here or there. So it all started with this, the just sort of standard 12 inches by 8 inches canvas that I do with me sketching in Sagat. Now I wanted him to be kind of screaming, I wanted him to be going a little berserk, but at first I wasn't having him really do anything. He wasn't doing a tiger shot, he was just sort of yelling, just standard headshot with like an expressive face, because I just wanted to relax and do something kind of fun, which then of course spiraled out of control based on what I ultimately did. So you can see here, this is me trying to get the exact exaggeration that I want and really capture the right version of Sagat for me. Now there's merit to these other versions. I like aspects of them, but it just wasn't really coming together. So you'll see here I go through a lot of iterations. Now we're starting to approximate where this piece is going to go. Instead of Sagat sort of screaming up and to the left, he's looking straight left. He's hunched over. That's actually one of my favorite ways to draw Sagat. If you have a photographic memory and you know that in the past I've drawn him sort of like this before, but maybe more of his body or something, really hunched over with a crazy back or something. I just really like that. I like doing that with Sagat. But here you can see that I start honing in on where his expression is going to be. Here he's got like a squinty eye because I thought that was kind of funny to have him be like full on, almost like eyes closed, just like screaming and stuff. But of course I lose like a certain amount of expression by doing that. This started to remind me of an older piece I did of JT Marsh from Exo Squad, where he's got squinty eyes because he's just really screaming. But for this one, I wanted him to also look a little crazed. And sometimes the craziest thing is when somebody's screaming, their eyes are just like wide open looking at you. Now, Sagat doesn't have irises or pupils, so looking at you, I mean, we just sort of have to assume that he's looking forward. But right now at this point in the piece, he's just indiscriminately screaming to the left side of the page. He's not really doing a thing. And so at this point, when I start messing around with like what I'm going to do with his jaw and all that, that's when I start thinking to myself, hey, what if I was doing like a really tight shot of him doing a tiger shot? A tight shot of a tiger shot. So you can see here I rough in the rest of his features, and I'm starting to think to myself, okay, I'm going to render this, and since I'm going to render it, I don't have to be really tight with my lines, so let's move into the arms. And so now here, even though I really enjoy this tight shot, I was thinking to myself, it'd be kind of cool if the frame was wider and I could show more of his arms without having to pull out. I wanted it to still be really tight on him. Something I always loved about the Street Fighter animated movie was how tight the camera would be during some of those action sequences. And it just felt like really visceral and really cool that we were seeing these larger than life characters sort of moving around. So that's what I wanted to still do here. So now here's where we move to the aspect ratio, the 4K aspect ratio, and I'm going through and nudging everything around. Now here's where I write risky 15 layers, because after I created this file, I realized that I was only going to get to do 15 layers. So I started, because this is now a technical challenge, this is now when you have to put your thinking cap on and start really planning. I started thinking, okay, well, Procreate has really smart copying and pasting. Let's try to take advantage of that. So I flatten his arm that's in the foreground. I flatten his head, neck, back area. I flatten his distant arm and then that distant part of his back right there. And then I'm like, okay, maybe this will work. So I start doing my first bit of rendering. So at this point, my layer count is the lines on top, the arm closest to us, the head and back in the middle, and then the arm in the distance. And I only get then, so what is that? 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 4. So now I've only got 9 more layers. Excuse me, math is hard. I've only got 11 more layers to try and capture the exact look and feel I want for the skin on the head and back. I can then use that as a test and obviously save my swatches as much as possible so that I can keep coming back to this and I can try to make everything as accurate as possible, because eventually I'm going to abandon this particular Procreate file and move to a fresh one in order to get the next piece done, which in this case I think is the arm. So I make a bunch of adjustments as I go, of course, because the lines are rough. I'm now just trying to render it as fast as possible. No, excuse me, not as fast as possible, I mean, as accurately as possible, while making up information as I go, because I want to slowly reduce the opacity of those lines to the point where I'm not relying on them anymore. So here I've got all these different layers now going on. I've got his face, his skin tones figured out, and I'm starting to add a bunch of volume in general. But the thing is, there, at least in my style of painting, a lot of the definition is going to come from the definition of the eye and the definition of the eye patch and all these other things, the definition of his mouth, because it's going to be a hard cut that's going to clean up all of that painting. So I'm flying partially blind at this point. So I sort of decide that where I'm at here is good enough for the skin. Maybe I'll come to it later. Maybe I can devise a methodology that'll allow me to come back to it later. And I decide to move on to the mouth. So I duplicate the file entirely, And in the new file, I flatten all of those head layers, and then I start on the mouth as if the mouth is its own thing. So now we have the exact same layers as before. We have the arm in the front, we have the head. I think by this point I've probably actually eliminated the back arm, and I'm just focusing on the mouth. So we've got arm, lines, head that's all been merged, head and back's all been merged, and then nothing behind it, and then all of the mouth layers. So that's 3 layers, and then the mouth, that leaves me with 12 layers that I can play with for all of the mouth stuff. So now that the mouth is wrapping up, what do? We duplicate that file, we merge all of the stuff in the mouth, we start working on the eye and the eye patch. And throw in that eyebrow scar real quick right there too while we're at it. So the eye, especially since his eyes are so tiny in this, and the eye patch is so simplistic because it's so dark, we're essentially done with this part of it, and we move on to the forearm, and not the forearm like the lower part of your arm, the arm that's in the foreground. The foreground arm. Same pattern as before. We've duplicated the layer. We have flattened everything that we're no longer going to touch, and we started rendering the foreground arm. And I don't know the layer count at this point, especially since I have the other stuff turned off. I did that occasionally, or maybe I deleted it just to give myself more layers. But we have, again, limited layers. And what we're going to try and do is paint the arm and the wrappings on his actual forearm. Now, something that you might be thinking about is, okay, you've identified your light source. At least maybe you're thinking this, that I've identified my light source as the tiger shot that he's going to be shooting. But it's not really taking on the color of the tiger shot. He's being lit neutrally, essentially, without a colored light of any kind. It's just sort of the standard yellow to purple, warm to cool. Well, that's because what I end up doing is I end up going back in later and doing almost like a tiger shot pass on all these layers and reinserting them in once they've got sort of like an oranginess applied to their highs. So as it stands right now, this arm is more complicated than his head was, because his head was just all skin except for a little bit of 5 o'clock shadow and some blush, whereas this now has to incorporate the wrappings, which I try to paint in fairly efficiently, because I know that a lot of that's going to get covered up by the tiger shot, but I don't know exactly how much it's going to be covered by the tiger shot yet because I haven't painted it. Again, a lot of this process probably could have been planned out a little bit better. I could have gone and done like a color key or a thumbnail, but instead I just sort of flew blind, which may not have been the smartest thing, but I was so focused on just trying to pull off the multiple file thing. So that's where a lot of that came from. So now we introduce the back arm. So this is another new file. And now we're going to be figuring that out. Now, of course, I actually duplicated, if you go back and you look at my line art, I duplicated the foreground arm and moved it to the back just to get a rough layout for the back arm. But now I had to sort of redraw it just to get just to make it his right arm instead of a duplicate of his left arm. This one is a fairly quick paint job. It's replicating, since, I mean, Sagat doesn't have a lot of clothes going on, so once you sort of figured out what the way his skin's going to work, you just replicate that a ton, especially a tight shot like this where we don't see his shorts or the wrappings on his feet. But again, even then, it'd be the same as the wrappings on his hands. So now just going through and doing that distant arm. All right, now we do a couple little tweaks here, and then we add the spit. Yes, this was its own file as well, just so that I made sure that I wasn't bumping into any layer limits while I did it. This is all just done by blocking out the white shape, lowering the opacity, and then doing a fill on everything outside of that shape and blurring it so that I can then get that soft ring around the entire outside like it's catching the light right there. And then I usually add like a little shine for good measure on there. There's a little bit of that yellowing that's going to come in from the tiger shot, and now we begin the tiger shot. I wanted the shape to be graphic, but obviously still be soft and look like it had energy, so I started with these big triangular shapes and then blurred it, and now putting in a bunch of like little particulate from the actual the impact or the sort of just energy and just plasmatic bullshit that's sort of coming off of his fists during this whole thing. And now I'm throwing in a bunch of these little sparks. So this is all on a new file where Sagat is almost entirely merged, and it's just the effect. Now here we are. I've gone through and edited in my yellowing pass, my orange glow pass, and that's what you're seeing here. Go back to the head file, add the yellowing glow in, and then take that out and paste it in. Go back to the arm, do the same thing there. Go back to the mouth, do the same thing there. And I'm essentially just going through all the layers now that I know the color of the tiger shot, and I'm applying that to all of these other files. So you're seeing all the yellowing going on, but how does this actually work? What's the mechanical nature of this process? Here's a screen grab where I can show you. This is the head layer as it was finished. So it's got the yellowing on it, the glow from the tiger shot. You can see here's the layers. It's all in that folder right there. And then you can see there's the arm layer on top and stuff. Let's duplicate that and just call it Sagat Demo or something so that we aren't messing with that original file. And now I'll show you how the compositing process works. Procreate is very smart about the way that it copies and pastes, especially if you're copying it from one canvas that's exactly the same size to another. It'll paste in place, which is something, for instance, in Photoshop, you have to do a specific keystroke in order to do. So here I've gone into the mouth file, I've turned off all the layers but the mouth, and if you go up to the top left to the wrench, and you go over to Image, and you hit Copy Canvas right there, it'll actually copy just the stuff that's visible with the opacity, or excuse me, with the transparency all preserved, which is really nice. So now we just go back over to the Sagat demo file. We make sure that we're on the right layer, which here we need to be on top of the head layer, right there. And now we go image, and we say paste. And it'll paste it right where we need it to be. You don't warp it, don't do anything. It's exactly where it's supposed to be. So just to keep this going so that you can see the way the rest of this process works, I won't go all the way, but just one or two more. Here we go into the eye file. You can see here we turn everything off except for the eye and the eye patch. We go over into the wrench, image, and then copy canvas. You can see there it is right there. Turned everything back on just to keep the file sort of preserved. Go back to this new demo file that we have, and I do a new layer, and then do the wrench, and then say paste. And boom, it'll go right into the spot where it's supposed to go. And now just for like a big large example, you can see right there, I'm trying to make a new layer and I'm hitting the limit layer. Even doing this demo, I was like, oh Christ, the limit. So now let's create a new layer. You see I flattened the head right there. Let's go to the arm, the Sagat front arm, which is right here. Again, turn off everything except for that arm. Go over to the wrench, go to copy canvas, exit the file, go back to the composite file, and then we say paste. Boom, there's the arm. And that's essentially the process for compositing all of this. Now, it gets a little bit more complicated in a minute. So here we are back to the process where I'm putting everything in. And now this is a brand new file where I've taken everything and I'm trying to work on the background. I wanted to sort of hint at the fight from the animated movie where there's lightning in the background and all of that. I thought it'd just be kind of fun and cool. So I start working with like one of the random brushes to get like a messy lightning bolt back there. I knew I was going to blur everything, and that's what I end up doing. I end up doing a motion blur on that background. And now what I'm working in is the composite file. I've brought everything together into this one file, and I need to make sure that it's all harmonious. So I threw in, you could see I tested a minute ago, some darkness behind Sagat to start pushing everything. And now I'm going through and I'm trying to refine stuff. There's some sharp edges and I want to get some of this brushy stuff in there. So I'm going through and I'm just trying to add a little bit more handcraftedness, even though the whole thing is technically handcrafted. I'm trying to add some handcraftedness back into the piece so that it feels I don't know, there's an authenticity to it that I'm trying to bring back into it. So now we've got this lightning in the top, so I wanted to get some light back there because it would look really nice if we had some blue backlighting to him on the shadowed side, and then on the side with the tiger shot, it all just stays warm and bright. So that was the idea behind the lighting for this. So you can see here, we then duplicated that rim light, blurred it, and then took the actual rim light itself and made it more of that bright light blue, and then the glowy part is more of the dark blue, so we're mimicking exactly what's happening in that lightning bolt back there. We've got motion blurs going all over the place to try and get this to look right. His distant arm got slightly blurred, so now that I'm putting that rim light on it, I have to slightly blur that as well. And then just a little bit of color correction so that we can get it a little bit bluer in the back there. Last but not least, something I want to mention is I did tweak this at the very end in Photoshop. That wasn't a part of the plan. When I was done with it, I wanted to get a little bit more. I viewed it on a computer instead of viewing it on my iPad, and I wanted to get a little bit more intensity in there. So at the very end of this whole thing, you're going to see the intensity of the tiger shot get a little brighter. So now here what we have is everything's been merged together. And then I've duplicated all of that and done a little bit of color balancing to get sort of more specifically the look I was going for. And this is where I started getting really messy as far as my usual process goes. And I started going in and hand painting in little tweaks here and there, just because I like to sit on a piece for like a day or two after I'm done with it, just to make sure that I'm like truly done with it. And so now is the phase where a bunch of little changes start coming in. Something that ended up being a last minute decision, which is a little bit weird, you might be spotting it right now, I'll zoom in so that you can see, is I start putting lines back in. I thought it'd be fun to do something where I actually had lines then brought in after it was rendered to support some of it and to add like a little bit of that just comic booky look to it. Some people have referenced who've seen the piece that it reminds them ever so slightly of what happened in Street Fighter 4 when they went with the ink brush stuff. Obviously, it's not nearly that extreme or that heavy, but it sort of starts hinting at that idea that it's got this cartoony backbone still to the look and feel even when trying to render something. Not that this is even remotely not cartoony. It just sort of adds to that a bit. So here I am with the fat pencil on a brand new layer on top of all the composited shit, just going in and adding in all of the details. And then I took those lines, I duplicated them, I made the original ones overlays, and I made the new ones just black. And that way I could pull away from the black one and have the more colorized ones shine through. Jesus, can't even talk today. There is the bright adjustment, so you can see now if you go back a second or two and then come forward again, you can see how the intensity ramped up quite a bit on that tiger shot. And that is the final piece. So I hope you enjoyed it. This was really experimental, and the file management stuff was really interesting to do. So thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this or you've enjoyed other videos, please consider liking and subscribing, and leave a suggestion on what you'd like to see next. And if you're looking for me on the internet, these are the places where you can find me.